discussing the 20th century in European history, it's interestingly under contention, under argument as to when the century begins and when it ends. And we can look at a pure definition of a century. The century should begin in 1900, and 100 years later it would then end in 2000. And that has been rejected by many historians. Instead, they look to a break in the European Victorian age of the 19th century, and then a more modern, what we consider 20th century outlook, possibly. So there are some historians who argue that the century begins in 1914, at the beginning of the First World War. There are those who argue, such as Niall Ferguson, who's become very popular lately with his bestseller War of the Worlds. He has argued that the century begins in 1905, and he chose that date because this is a very important year for Russia and in the East. And Japan defeated Russia in the Far East during that year, and led to various changes, which he saw as a break in the past. And then there are those who discuss that it's the post-World War I era as where it should begin. Then we have to discuss the end of the century. Some people argue that the end of the century happens in 1989, when the revolutions in Eastern Europe begin and crumble the communist-led governments in Central and Eastern Europe. Some people would push it all the way to 91, possibly when Russia too reemerges as a nation from being under the idea of the Soviet Union, and the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that marks the end. And it's my perspective that maybe some of these things are still too fresh to determine, especially the end, because as history is written, we look back to history to find justifications and reasons for what is happening now. So if you look from a 1950 perspective on the past century as to why things were happening, critical dates would possibly emerge. When you look from 1975, other dates might emerge. You look from 2000, other dates might emerge. I don't know personally if I feel we can manage in terms of determining this as to when this century ends. Why don't I argue for 91 to be the end? Because I think much happens following that in the Southeast with the breakup of Yugoslavia. We have wars and genocide reappear on the continent in the mid-90s and into the late 90s. And the situation in Southeastern Europe is still very tenuous today. Some people might look at this again in a different perspective, and that's okay. And part of historiography, and historiography is the way we write history, is picking and choosing dates and trying to determine why things happened and what were the trigger points to these events. Now, this is not a matter of truth or non-truth. A good historian always uses facts. If you have a historian not using facts, then they're not a historian. There's nothing to it. So when you hear conspiracy theories and such, or people dismantle certain history in certain ways, and they play with the facts, then we need to just dismiss that outright. What a historian does is he or she takes facts and looks at these facts and tries to determine how they all played out together and which fact was more important than the other. So, for example, what fact can we look at? If we look at the causes of World War I, we might say, well, some people would point to the assassination of the Archduke Francis Ferdinand as the fact that begins the war. So that occurred. We all can agree, there's plenty of historical evidence that an assassination took place. Now, whether that was the critical moment that began World War One is the part where historians then begin the debate. Because some people would say, well, this is an immediate cause, but there were prior things building up to this point that caused the European powers to come to war. So when we're looking at the century, that's what we need to take a step up into in our perspective, is that each of these historians who discuss 20th century history, and I'll be mentioning a number, each take their view as what are the important events, and then how they all played out. Okay, and so again, we're not going to say they didn't tell the truth. We're going to say that we don't maybe agree with the importance they play on certain events, and maybe you would argue for some other events as being important. And that's what the work of historians is about. And the 20th century is a complex issue. We have multiple empires at the beginning of the century. So we have the British Empire, which controls 40% of the world's people in 1900. 40% of the world's people are under the auspices of the British Empire. Tiny little island nation with that kind of control, based on a large navy and industrialization and so many other factors. There are also other empires on the continent. The German Empire controls much of the old German states. Germany itself has become a major player on at the turn of the century. They had only united as a country. The idea of Germany being in existence doesn't even happen to 1871. And Germany is considered the greatest threat to the old world order of the continent, where Britain and France vied for a certain amount of power in the West, and Russia in the East. So we have other empires as well, the German Empire in the north. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the central area and reaching towards the Mediterranean. And again, it's a large multinational empire, and in a certain weak state in many ways, and losing power to Germany in control of the region. There's also the Great Russian Empire, which was the largest empire in terms of landmass on the planet. And even today, Russia is the largest country in the world. 1/6 of the world's land is contained in the modern-day country of Russia. And the Russian Empire was much larger than the current Russia is today. And again, it's a weakening empire for various reasons. And so at the beginning of the century, we have weak empires, new threats, and changing politics as to how these will occur. These new events will play out. By the end of the century, we have all the empires have collapsed, and they collapsed following World War I or during the war. And we had, a time period when the continent seemed divided among communist nations and free nations. We'll talk about how this is a bit of a limited perspective. And then we come to the end of the century with the European Union uniting, or in the process of uniting, most of the nations of the continent under rules and regulations that enhance human rights and improve economic conditions for the peoples of Europe, and the European Union becomes the second greatest trading bloc on the planet. So much has changed in this century. We're going to try and look at the causes and conditions that played out and why this might have occurred.